There are commands in Scripture that people read but hope they never have to face. This is one of those moments. Before you interpret what follows, you need to feel its weight first, because this passage resists neutrality. It demands a response before understanding can form. This is 1 Samuel 15, one of the most consequential turning points in the entire biblical record. A king standing before a command he will not fully obey. And what follows does not remain in history. It moves forward into ancient patterns, into unresolved structures, into the present moment. Something about Amalek is different from every other enemy in Scripture, but most readers never identify what it is. We will get there, but first you need to understand where Amalek appears and how. The first appearance of Amalek is not on a formal battlefield. It is in the wilderness. Israel has just departed Egypt, not as a structured nation, but as an exhausted, fragile lineage moving through radical uncertainty. Identity is still forming under pressure. Survival is not guaranteed. Don't miss this detail. Amalek does not strike the front. It attacks from behind. Not the strong, not the prepared, the rear, the exhausted, the weak, the ones barely keeping pace. Exodus 17 records it with striking restraint. No emotional language, only precision. This is not conventional warfare. It is the deliberate targeting of vulnerability. Then Deuteronomy 25 adds a defining line. They did not fear God. That single statement becomes the moral anchor for everything that follows. And then something unusual occurs. God does not permit this moment to dissolve into history. He commands remembrance. Remember what Amalek did. But in the Hebrew understanding, memory is never passive recall. It is active continuity. It shapes identity, direction, and the legacy you transmit to those who come after you. What would you have done in that moment, at the threshold of complete exhaustion when survival itself was uncertain? That is not a historical question. It is a diagnostic of the soul. Now, this is where most readers miss the shift entirely. In ancient Hebrew interpretation, the name Amalek is associated through gematria, the traditional numerical system of Hebrew words, with the number 240, and that same number corresponds with Safek, the Hebrew word for doubt. This is not coincidence. This is design, structured correspondence within the interpretive tradition itself, and it reframes everything. Amalek is not a conventional enemy. It emerges precisely at the most vulnerable threshold, when clarity weakens, when exhaustion rises, when conviction begins to fracture. So the question surfaces, and it does not leave quietly. Is Amalek only an ancient people, or an ancient pattern that reactivates whenever certainty begins to collapse? As the narrative develops, Amalek ceases to be only a people. It becomes a persistent pattern, a condition that surfaces whenever strength collapses and inner clarity weakens. Then comes the critical moment. 1 Samuel 15. King Saul receives a direct command, absolute in structure, unambiguous in scope. Confront Amalek completely. And this is where everything breaks. Not in rebellion. Saul hesitates. He spares King Agag. He preserves what appears valuable through human reasoning. He filters a divine instruction through the lens of selective logic. This is the fracture point, partial obedience, presented as wisdom. Pay close attention here, because this is where the interpretation changes direction entirely. This is not loud rebellion. It is controlled deviation wrapped in justification, and it transforms everything that follows. Centuries later, in the book of Esther, the recurring pattern surfaces through Haman, identified explicitly as an Agagite. What is unresolved does not disappear. It returns, because what is not fully confronted in one generation reappears with force in the next. Take a moment to receive that. The gematria correspondence deepens this further. Amalek equals 240. Safek, doubt, equals 240. It doesn't just attack from the outside, it works from within, quietly, within perception itself. The recurring pattern is not only external hostility, it mirrors internal instability, the quiet erosion of certainty from the inside. This is where the narrative becomes genuinely uncomfortable. If Amalek represents a persistent pattern, then Saul's failure is no longer simply history. It becomes a mirror. Saul did not reject the instruction outright. He reinterpreted it. He selected what aligned with his reasoning and set aside the rest. Where have you done exactly what Saul did, and still believed you were right? If you were standing in that moment, aware of a divine weight, yet internally conflicted, would your response truly differ? This is where the tension moves inward, because the conflict is no longer simply between obedience and rebellion. It is between full alignment and rationalized partiality. In our time, this unresolved pattern appears as discernment, as wisdom, as balance. But the text presses a harder question. At what point does your interpretation become distortion? Saul's unraveling was not caused by ignorance. It was caused by the fragmentation of his alignment. Allow that to settle. To perceive the deeper structure, we return to the ancient Hebrew root, harem, often rendered as devotion to destruction, but in its deeper linguistic origin, it designates something set apart, fully withdrawn from ordinary use and placed entirely under divine authority. The ancient pattern now sharpens with precision. Amalek is repeatedly associated with coldness, a symbolic diminishing of conviction, a gradual weakening of inner clarity. Saul's failure represents not rebellion, but fragmentation. And fragmentation is never stable. It echoes, it repeats, it resurfaces in the generation that inherits it. This is precisely why Haman's emergence carries such profound narrative weight. It reflects the continuity of an unresolved pattern, persisting across generations until alignment is no longer divided. At this point, the narrative ceases to be external. It becomes a reflection. Saul's unraveling was not rooted in a lack of exposure to truth. It was rooted in selective alignment with truth, and that distinction is consequential. Most defining moments are not between obvious right and wrong. They are between complete alignment and measured compromise. Where does compromise begin to quietly reshape conviction in your own life? Where does almost obedience begin to redefine the legacy you are building for your children and your children's children without you even perceiving it? This is critical. The text does not resolve this tension cleanly. It leaves it active. Because some patterns are not designed to be explained away, they are designed to be recognized. So Amalek remains unresolved within the narrative, not because the text is incomplete, but because the unresolved pattern itself persists. This is not merely ancient history. It is structured memory, and memory is never static. It reactivates under precise conditions, weakness, fatigue, and the fracturing of certainty. If this account has unsettled something within you, that is not accidental. It is precisely the function of the Word. Don't miss what comes next, because the next layer of this unresolved pattern, when traced through Scripture, reveals connections that most readers never perceive. But once seen, it cannot be unseen. If this pattern is real, then it has already appeared in your life, because by the time you recognize it, it may already be shaping your decisions. And unless you know exactly where to look, you may never see it coming.